Alright folks, we're gonna get a little wet. Sorry about that. What? Okay?
On the morning of July 3rd, 2017, the pilot, Russ Lucas, made an emergency landing of a hot air balloon carrying 16 tourists to avoid a collision with nearby power lines. As the balloon came down in a retention pond, water quickly began seeping into the basket with terrified passengers. However, the real danger lay right beneath, since the Central Florida pond was home to American alligators, some reaching over 4.5 meters in length, with powerful jaws strong enough to tear apart nearly every person in the basket within seconds. Fortunately, emergency responders arrived quickly, and everyone on board escaped with only a scare and almost no injuries. Still, this hot air balloon incident was just an exception, only one of the very few shocking accidents that ended this well, and the people in the others weren't even nearly as lucky. But first, as always, viewer discretion is advised. On June 1st, 2022, at around 8:15 p.m., residents in the small town of Burlington, Wisconsin saw something they didn't expect. A low-flying hot air balloon hovering dangerously close to rooftops and power lines. On that day, 62-year-old pilot Jimmy Winder was just finishing a nearly 3-hour scenic flight over the Lake Geneva area with 2 thrilled passengers in the basket, 37-year-old Nikolay Velchev and 36-year-old Elena Petrova, both from Arlington Heights, Illinois. The pilot planned to end the flight with a soft landing near a side road on the 400 block of Calumet Street that ran parallel to a set of active train tracks. However, he slightly miscalculated, landing the balloon instead on a grassy strip between the road and the tracks. And at that very horrific moment, the partially deflated envelope began drifting sideways, directly into the path of a northbound freight train. Desperately trying to avoid a collision, the Canadian National Train engineer immediately activated the emergency brakes. But unfortunately, there wasn't enough time. In an instant, the gondola was struck by a passing train car and violently dragged, with all 3 occupants eventually thrown to the ground. Horrified bystanders immediately called emergency services. Upon arrival, 1 victim was taken by ambulance, while the other 2 were airlifted to Freighter Hospital, as all of them had suffered blunt force trauma from being brutally thrown out of the basket. But luckily, since the impact occurred close to ground level, their lives were not in danger, and all the passengers were eventually released from the hospital the very next day. In the end, the incident was officially attributed to pilot error, as Winder misjudged the distance during landing, and while many fellow balloon pilots described him as absolutely experienced and were shocked that he lost control, the pilot in the next chilling incident didn't even have the proper license, despite carrying dozens of passengers on board. This video captures a truly touching moment. Tiago Ribeiro Campinas proposing to his 27-year-old fiancée, Gabrielle Rosa de Nascimento, right in the middle of a hot air balloon flight. A trembling scene every newlywed dreams of reliving again and again. But Gabrielle herself would later describe it with just one haunting phrase. What should have been a happy day of engagement became a nightmare for life. The flight of June 15, 2025 was meant to be a romantic celebration for Brazil's Dia dos Namorados, the local equivalent of Valentine's Day. The balloon lifted off from Ipero, Sao Paulo, carrying 33 passengers, along with a pilot and an assistant. But less than 30 minutes after takeoff, the wind began to pick up, and Gabrielle started to worry. She voiced her concerns about safety to the pilot, but he reassured her and claimed the weather was still within limits. Shortly after her proposal at 7:50 a.m., Gabrielle saw another balloon nearby descending fast, clearly in trouble. And just moments later, their own balloon began to accelerate, eventually losing control entirely. Then, in an instant, they crashed into an orange grove, with 4 people violently thrown from the basket upon impact. The balloon briefly lifted off again, only to slam down a second time, as passengers screamed and scrambled to jump out, or brace for the crash, which ultimately injured 11 other people, including Gabrielle herself. However, the most horrifying scene was still ahead. Gabrielle soon saw the lifeless body of another passenger, 27-year-old Juliana Alves Prado Pereira, as her newlywed husband, Leandro de Aquino Pereira, desperately tried to bring her back. But the traumatic injuries Juliana sustained in the crash were far too severe, and unfortunately, she was later pronounced dead at the hospital in Sorocaba. While the full autopsy report is still pending, there's a heartbreaking possibility that Juliana may have been pregnant at the time of her death. But what's absolutely clear is who stood behind the deadly flight. It turned out that the pilot, Fabio Salvador Pereira, had no valid license to conduct commercial flights and was immediately arrested after the crash. Worse yet, the balloon wasn't even part of the official Brazilian hot air ballooning championship taking place nearby. It was operating as an illegal tourist flight without any government oversight whatsoever. And while Fabio Salvador Pereira now faces charges including aggravated manslaughter and operating an unauthorized aircraft, the pilot in the next case was a seasoned professional, and yet even he couldn't prevent the tragedy. 65-year-old Daniel T. Kirk had over 30 years of experience, more than 660 flight hours, festival appearances, and the deep respect of ballooning professionals across the country. On May 9, 2014, he was scheduled to make a routine flight during the inaugural Mid-Atlantic Balloon Festival in Ruther Glen, Virginia, carrying 2 passengers on board, 44-year-old Guinea Doyle and 25-year-old Natalie Lewis, both prominent coaches of the University of Richmond women's basketball team. At 7 p.m., they lifted off from Meadow Event Park, along with 2 other balloons. As part of the program, they were supposed to float a short distance northeast and land safely in a designated zone, all while enjoying the scenic ride, of course. 40 minutes later, the first 2 balloons safely reached the ground, while Kirk's, being the third, drifted just a little too far off course. He briefly reignited the burner, but within seconds the basket struck a live power line at a height of 9 meters. The fire immediately engulfed both the basket and the lower envelope, while the burning balloon began to ascend again, this time rising to a shocking 90 meters above the ground. Fearing they would be burned alive, Guinea Doyle and Daniel Kirk made the desperate decision to jump, and eventually both were killed instantly by the fall, suffering extensive blunt force injuries to the head, torso, limbs, neck, and chest. Meanwhile, the charred remains of Natalie Lewis were later found still inside the balloon's basket, which had landed in a wooded area not far from the crash zone. In the end, this tragedy was also officially attributed to pilot error, a miscalculation that cost the lives of 3 people, including Daniel Kirk himself. But the next case took even more lives, and to this day, it remains the deadliest hot air balloon disaster ever recorded. On February 26, 2013, the world was shaken by terrifying footage. A hot air balloon engulfed in flames mid-air, drifting helplessly above the ancient city of Luxor, Egypt, before exploding and crashing into a sugarcane field below. That shocking morning, the balloon operated by Sky Cruise was carrying 20 tourists, including visitors from Hong Kong, Japan, Britain, France, and Hungary, along with an Egyptian tour guide and a 30-year-old pilot, Momin Murad. As the balloon began its descent, the ground crew attempted to secure a landing line, but that same rope got caught on a fuel hose, creating a pressurized gas leak just feet above the ground, and moments later, the fire broke out. The pilot and 1 British passenger, 49-year-old Michael Rennie, managed to jump out at around 15 meters as flames began engulfing the basket. But without their weight, the balloon suddenly shot upward, rising to nearly 300 meters, now fully ablaze. And then, in the sky over Luxor, the propane tank suddenly exploded. 7 passengers were seen leaping to their deaths, described by witnesses as falling like fireballs. The balloon, in turn, crashed into the field moments later, killing 12 more people instantly. In the end, only 2 of the 21 people on board survived, Momin Murad and Michael Rennie, though the pilot suffered burns over 70% of his body. This tragedy was later attributed to a faulty gas connection, compounded by poor safety procedures and a lack of emergency shutoff controls, which ultimately led to the suspension of Sky Cruise's operations. And horrifically, a nearly identical tragedy of a balloon catching fire in midair, with passengers desperately jumping to escape, happened again, just recently, on June 21, 2025, in Praia Grande, Brazil. A suspected malfunction involving a backup torch or flame control system led to a fire that broke out just minutes after takeoff. Of the 21 people on board, 8 were killed. 4 burned alive inside the basket, while 4 others died from blunt trauma after leaping from a height of around 45 meters. Though the remaining 13 passengers suffered burns of various degrees, they were extremely lucky to survive, because fire usually shows no mercy, and neither does water, as seen in our next shocking case. On the morning of October 19, 1995, a hot air balloon carrying 9 people lifted off for a short sightseeing tour over New Brighton Beach, New Zealand. But as the group prepared for landing, a sudden squall line, a fast-moving wall of wind, hit the coast without warning. Yanked violently upward to nearly 500 meters, the balloon was then blown straight out to the ocean, And though the pilot tried to regain control, it was already too late, since moments later the floating vessel began descending rapidly and crash-landed in the frigid waters of the South Pacific, roughly 200 meters from shore. Several passengers were instantly thrown into the crashing surf. The pilot desperately urged the others to swim to shore, but in the cold, rough waves, only 6 people made it out alive, though suffering severe hypothermia, as water temperatures in that region hover around 11 degrees Celsius in October. Yet the other 3 passengers weren't even nearly as lucky and drowned before local fishermen and rescuers could reach them. Tragically, there were no life jackets on board, not even during a coastal flight. Had they been available, those lives may have been saved. But the next case was even more hopeless, and survival would require nothing short of a miracle. This haunting photo captures a serene yet chilling moment. A Chinese woman and her child rising into the air on what was supposed to be a peaceful balloon ride. At that moment, they appeared calm, unaware that the peak of their flight would come at a shocking 3,000 meters above the ground. It was October 1st, 2019, China's National Day, at a scenic ecotourism village near Yantai, Shandong Province. 31-year-old Miss Suo and her 3-year-old son boarded a helium balloon attraction, part of a festive event at a local park. The ride, designed to rise just 50 meters while remaining safely tethered to the ground, was meant to offer a brief moment of wonder and family joy. But in an instant, the balloon broke free and began to rise, slowly at first, then higher and higher, eventually becoming a shrinking dot in the sky. Hundreds of stunned visitors watched helplessly from the ground as the mother and child ascended far beyond safety, their silhouettes fading into the clouds. Having reached maximum altitude, the helium balloon suddenly ruptured, and then came the fall, with both victims plummeting to their deaths, still harnessed side by side. As it would later turn out, the ride was completely unauthorized, and within 48 hours of the tragedy, 5 organizers of the balloon activity were arrested. Yet the horrifying sight of this deadly fall would likely haunt the witnesses in that park for years to come, since the victims never stood a chance. But what if I told you that one person in our next case actually survived a fall from the same shocking height? On January 14th, 2024, 13 people boarded a hot air balloon near Eloy, Arizona. Among them were 8 professional skydivers, ready to ascend to 3,000 meters and complete their scheduled jump aboard a balloon piloted by 37-year-old Cornelius Vanderwalt, a respected figure in the local aviation scene, and founder of Drop-Line Hot Air Balloon Rides. Among the remaining 4 passengers was 23-year-old Valerie Studerheimer, taking her first ever balloon ride, eager to admire the vast beauty of the Arizona desert from above, along with her close friend, Eteyan Kelkoti. At around 7:05 a.m., after reaching jump altitude, the skydivers leapt one by one from the basket, free-falling safely toward the drop zone below. But within minutes of their exit, something went horribly wrong. The balloon envelope began to collapse, its upper fabric fraying and trailing as if torn or melted after the sudden loss of weight from the 8 skydivers, most of them athletic men. The basket, now unstable and without sufficient lift, began a rapid and uncontrolled descent. With no parachutes and no way to slow down, the balloon carrying the pilot and 4 passengers eventually slammed into the desert floor just east of Sunshine Boulevard and Hannah Road. 3 passengers were instantly killed on impact, including Valerie's friend, Eteyan Kelkoti. Valerie herself, along with the pilot, was immediately airlifted in critical condition to a trauma center in Phoenix. That same day, Cornelius Vanderwalt died from multiple blunt force injuries, while Valerie became the sole survivor among the passengers left in the basket. Her condition, however, was life-altering. She sustained multiple broken bones and a traumatic brain injury, requiring numerous surgeries. Valerie's parents, Martha and Tony Sutterheim, launched a fundraiser seeking $150,000 to support her long-term rehabilitation and wrote the following update about their daughter's state. Her bones will eventually heal, but her ability to walk and otherwise move is uncertain. She currently cannot speak to us. What we do know is that Valerie has a very long road of rehabilitation and care ahead. In the aftermath of the tragic crash, Drop-Line Hot Air Balloon Rides suspended operations, and the true cause was ultimately determined to be mechanical, a catastrophic failure of the balloon's envelope, involving thermal damage and frayed rim tape. Yet worse than a disaster involving one hot air balloon is when there are 2 of them. And that's exactly what happened in our final case for today. It was the early morning of May 20th, 2013, and over 100 hot air balloons were floating peacefully above the breathtaking volcanic rock formations of Gorim National Park, a world-famous ballooning destination in Cappadocia, Turkey. But around 6:13 a.m., that serenity was shattered. 2 balloons, flying at slightly different altitudes, were drifting near the town of Ortaheiser, when one balloon's basket tore through the envelope of another from below. The damaged one eventually lost lift almost instantly and began to plummet. Witnesses in nearby balloons captured the horror on video, the envelope collapsing mid-air and the basket spinning uncontrollably as it plunged toward the rocky ground below. In the end, more than 20 tourists were injured, some seriously, suffering blunt force trauma during the crash landing, and unfortunately 3 Brazilian passengers did not survive the impact. Authorities later attributed the tragedy to a sudden shift in wind direction, which caused the 2 balloons to drift dangerously close together. And yet, even more balloons took off the very next day. Even more shockingly, a strikingly similar accident occurred less than 4 years later, on March 14, 2017, in nearly the exact same place. Only that time, 3 balloons were involved, and 49 people were injured, including 9 with deep fractures. But miraculously, no one died. According to data from the Blackburn-Worth Injury Team, approximately 3,000 hot air balloon accidents occur worldwide each year, with nearly 20 incidents annually in the United States alone. In the pursuit of thrill, beauty, or once-in-a-lifetime moments, many passengers never truly consider the risk, because sometimes, with hot air ballooning, there are no second chances. Just one unexpected gust of wind, one oversight by the ground crew, or one unlicensed pilot behind the burner is all it takes to turn a dreamlike experience into a free-falling nightmare. And now, let me ask you, have you ever flown in a hot air balloon? And after everything you've seen today, would you still want to? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more shocking, real-life stories that one day might convince you to take a regular road trip instead of tempting fate hundreds of meters above the ground.